Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this next session of No More Violence Week. We're really grateful for all of the support we've had this week and really looking forward to many of you joining us today. A special shout out to Tina and Brian. Thank you for joining us from the state. My name is Jamie Marshall. I serve on the planning team for No More Violence Week. And a lot of the sessions today are very much supported by our Missing and Murdered Indigenous and Human Trafficking Task Force that we have here in the Cascade County area. So I am going to turn it over to Shanna Bullock-Chisholm with the JDC, who chairs that task force, to take it from here.
Excellent. Thank you, Jamie. Well, I'm very pleased to be able to announce Tina and Brian today joining us for No More Violence Week. It's really a pleasure to have them. A couple of quick Zoom housekeeping notes before we begin. We will be sending out certificates of attendance next week, so be watching for those in your inbox. And today's session will be recorded, so if you prefer to keep your video off or to hide your name, please feel free to do so. You can do that by pressing the 3 small circles in the upper right-hand corner of the box next to your name/video. If you have questions or comments along the way, please add them into the chat feature and we'll make sure that our presenters get them. And there will be time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'm excited to introduce today's speakers. Tina Chamberlain is the Looping and Native Communities Link Coordinator for the Montana Missing Indigenous Persons Task Force. Tina works for the Montana Department of Justice within the Division of Criminal Investigation, Special Services Bureau. In her role with DOJ, she coordinates task force efforts to identify barriers to reporting missing Native Americans, jurisdictional issues, advocacy for families, and identifying strategies to reduce the number of missing in Montana. She conducts community listening sessions in tribal communities in urban Indian areas, working with families, law enforcement, and tribal leaders, and presents to the State Tribal Relations Interim Committee on behalf of the task force. Brian Frost has worked for the Montana Department of Justice for over 10 years now. He began his career in the Communications Center at the Montana Highway Patrol. He often took calls from worried family members with overdue travelers and assisted families with referrals to appropriate law enforcement agencies when they called about missing persons. Beginning in January of 2017, Brian worked at DOJ's Division of Criminal Investigation as a training officer for Montana's Criminal Justice Information Network, better known as CJIN. He's an expert on CJIN, the FBI NCIC Missing Persons File, and the inner workings of the public Montana Missing Persons website. Brian became the Missing Persons Specialist in May 2020. Welcome, Brian and Tina, and I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, well, I'm going to get started. I'm going to share my screen. We really appreciate you guys spending time out of your busy days to kind of listen to us speak a little while. And then if you have questions, by all means, ask. That's what we're here for. In our case, we're going to give you a whole bunch of information. It's an awful lot. So, you don't have to absorb it all, but I do think there's a lot of good, valuable tips and things we'll mention today. So, like everybody mentioned, I am the missing person specialist for Montana DOJ. I got to start as a dispatcher. After being a dispatcher, I got to be a training officer where I got to really apply all the things I learned as a dispatcher, talking to people in crisis, really communicating and understanding things, and got to apply that as a trainer. And then as a trainer, I enjoyed doing that for several years, and now I kind of took the next step and applied the things I learned as a trainer to missing persons. So not only do I help take missing persons calls and act as a liaison between families and law enforcement, but I also get to speak on the topic of missing persons, something I feel pretty passionately about. So Tina, if there's anything else you want to add before we get started?
Well, I want to thank Shanna for reaching out to us and inviting us to participate in this today. We're going to give you a lot of information. I know that people like to have copies of the PowerPoints. This PowerPoint is so big and it's got so much information that I don't think we would be able to send it to you. So they are recording this and we'll upload it to their YouTube channel. So you will have access to this PowerPoint that way. I do have a background in victim services. I was over at the Board of Crime Control working as a state administrator for violence against women and sexual assault services funding. And that kind of led me to this position. And so I'm really excited to be able to share some of what I've learned over the last year.
Awesome.
Take it away, Brian.
So a couple things we're going to mention. We'll talk about reporting missing persons. I think it's important. I'm hoping that nobody in the audience today has had to report a missing person. But if you had, I am sorry. I hope it was a pretty decent experience, at least in the reporting aspect of things. But I'll talk about reporting missing persons. I'll talk a bit about public alerts. We get an awful lot of questions at Montana Department of Justice about Amber Alerts and missing and endangered person advisories, the difference between them, why are they issued, things like that. So I do want to kind of dispel myths and kind of help education for that. We'll also talk about legislative updates, both 2019 and the current legislative session here in 2021. We'll talk about the task force, the link networking, and also statistics. So like we've been mentioning, there's a lot of information. Let's get started. So kind of one of the things that I focus on in my position here is, what defines a missing person? What is a missing person for us? And I think honestly, a good general definition for a missing person is someone where we don't know where they are and we don't really know if they're okay. Right? This could be an overdue motorist. This could be, I hate using the term juvenile runaway, but it could be a youth that is purposely left home. This could be all sorts of different things. It could be an elderly person who has walked away from a nursing home. They suffer from dementia or Alzheimer's. I mean, there's a lot of, it is kind of a broad brush to say it that way, but really there is a broad brush for missing persons. Frequently asked, well, what do you look for in a missing person? The truth is it could be anybody. So what I want to focus on is, well, how do you report a missing person? One of the things we really see is a lot of folks, there's kind of this ingrained myth in the back of our minds that there's a waiting period for reporting a missing person. That is not true, and thankfully it hasn't been true here in Montana. There is no minimum amount of time you have to wait to report a loved one missing. So one of the things I say is, if you've got somebody missing, you know that you're going to go through the standard progression of, okay, you're going to call their friends, you're going to call parents if it's a loved one, you're going to call the school, a child loved one, you're going to call the school. So you're going to make all these different phone calls, and those are reasonable things to do, but just know that those take time. So for us, from a law enforcement perspective, the earlier in a missing person investigation that you notify law enforcement, they can start looking also. So when you are going to report a missing loved one, you should be dialing 911. You're going to reach the local communication center in that area, and you basically, I would state, hey, I'm so-and-so, I would like to report a missing person, and then kind of go from there. The biggest thing is you don't have to wait. I'm always amazed when Tina and I speak to audiences. Well, we generally ask, hey, how long do you have to wait to report a missing person? And we've heard 24 hours, 48 hours, I heard 96 hours. Luckily, that's not true. There is not a minimum waiting period, so please don't think that. Once you guys make the call, you're talking to a 911 center dispatcher or maybe a records department personnel, depending on where you call. Both them and the officer will ask a whole bunch of questions. And it may be all at once. It may be that initial phone call. It could be the officer that responds to your location to write a report. It could be a combination of both. Every agency and every jurisdiction does things differently. There's no right or wrong, but I do want to kind of express some of the information that they might be asking or might be gathering. Now, I'm not going to read the whole slide to you. I think that's kind of insulting, but there's a couple things I want to point out. The easy ones are name, sex, and date of birth. Those are required for database entry. Those are required for really identifying a person. So name, sex, and date of birth. They should be asking alias information. Hopefully they're not saying, can I get alias names? Because that kind of sounds like a bank robber, and they have, AKAs, which are also known as. We're not looking for alias in terms of nefarious purposes. But alias information really means nicknames, actual nicknames that they go by, because that can also help find somebody if maybe they don't go by their real name. I have two coworkers that don't go by their real names. They actually go by their middle names. So some of that can be pretty important when trying to identify a missing person. Numerically, there's a couple things we want. I mentioned date of birth. If you have a social security number, that can be really beneficial. But on top of that, we really want a date of last contact. We call it a DLC, or date of last contact. When was the last time that anybody has spoken to them and made sure that they were okay? Because that helps law enforcement identify a timeline already, and it's an important field for the database. We really want to know, when was the last time somebody had contact with them and they were okay? Because that can really help the search. Address information, it's not as important with adults. I'll tell you that typically, if my brother was to go missing or my wife was to go missing, yes, I would provide their information, either my brother's apartment address, my home address, but you've already looked for the missing person at those locations. For children, it's very important. So what they ask for a lot of times is frequently traveled places. So where does the child frequent? Do they go to the public library? Are there specific parks that they like to visit? What they found is that if a child goes missing and they're lost, if they find an area familiar with them, they will tend to gravitate towards that area. So if it is a park that they frequent, that's great information to know. Like I said, not as important for adults, but for children, it's very important. We do want physical information that really helps us narrow down and identify missing persons. So we like to see height, weight, physicals like that, hair color, eye color. How do they keep their hair? Is it long? Do they have dreadlocks? Is it kind of cut short? I have brown curly hair. It's relatively unique. So that's one of those things that can stand out. We do want race, and we're not asking for race as a statistical purpose. Generally speaking, it's a good information. If they're biracial, it doesn't matter in terms of a response what race someone is, but it can help identify persons. When we mention physical information, we're also not just talking about height, weight type physical information. We're also talking about birthmarks. Are there scars that they have that stand out? Do they have any kind of tattoos? One of the things that people forget an awful lot about is clothing and jewelry. So, I always wear my wedding ring. Of course, my clothes always change day to day, but my wedding ring, my necklace, they're always on. So that can be really important information for helping to identify a person, especially a person who suffers from dementia or Alzheimer's, and maybe they're not as quick to mention who they are. Some folks going through some mental issues, a lot of these things can help. So even though their clothes will change day to day, some of the jewelry may not change. So I think it's often overlooked. Additionally, we do ask, and I do think it's important, for health concerns. We will ask, are they going through any kind of mental trauma? Have they been suicidal? Are they known to abuse drugs? Are they known to abuse alcohol? Do they take medications? The goal from a law enforcement perspective is not to classify somebody, it's not to embarrass them, but there's a lot of good information that can be given both from a safety aspect, from a law enforcement safety aspect, as well as from kind of a public aspect of we need to know if there are places that they frequent. If they are maybe into drugs, they know maybe to go towards the sketchier side of town to look for them, or maybe somebody's had some contact with them. Like I said, it's not to embarrass them, but I do think it's important information. Other things to mention in the report. So typically what you do is you call 911, you will talk to a dispatcher, and they will start taking information. They will enter that information into what we call a CAD, which is a computer-aided dispatch, or an RMS, which is a record management system. Then they'll assign an officer to that specific CAD reporter or RMS, and then the officer will make contact with you. Sometimes it's all done within 5 minutes, sometimes it takes a little longer. Like I said, every agency is different, but that's typically how it's done. The officer or the dispatcher can be asking you for the information, but there is quite a bit of info, as you can tell, that you really can provide that you may not think about. So when we start talking about additional information, one of the big things is a photograph. Photographs are probably the most helpful thing other than name, sex, and date of birth for a missing person. What we ask for is we do ask for a photo of somebody in their element, meaning what they look like on a typical Tuesday. In today's case, we're mid-afternoon on a Thursday or early afternoon on a Thursday. What do we look like in our element? I will say that oftentimes with missing persons, people have tried to submit photographs of weddings. They've tried to do like senior photos, school pictures. Those photos aren't bad. I mean, they're not horrible, but it's not typically what you look like on an everyday basis. People that change their hairstyle a lot, people that change their hair color, things like that. We want something pretty recent and what they look like on a typical Thursday. It's not something you really think about. And a lot of times, as a parent, you might go, oh, well, here's just a photo I have, and you try to pick the nicer one. But really choose a photo that kind of best represents them, because it can really help identify a missing person. Additionally, you may be asked dental and x-ray information. Law enforcement may ask, do they have x-rays on file? Do you have some of their dental information? Do you know what dentist they visit? Unfortunately, it's kind of towards the morbid side. Jewelry is fantastic for telling people, helping identify a missing person. So are x-rays, usually in the case if a body is found. Luckily, and we'll talk about statistics, and most missing persons are found here in Montana, and they're found alive and well, and it's a pretty positive interaction, but sometimes bodies are found. And dental and x-ray information, and even jewelry type, a lot of that information can help identify a body. Lastly, which is a bit more positive, vehicle information. We have got quite a few people on this call. I would like you guys to be thinking about your own vehicles. Think about what makes your vehicle stand out. You know, I can go in our parking lot out here and find probably 2 or 3 different Toyota RAV4s. What makes those Toyota RAV4s stick out? That's one of the things that we really mention and we kind of stress upon people, especially with adults. You know, if we're going to help find a missing person, what makes that silver Toyota RAV4 or that white Honda Accord stand out? Think about bumper stickers. Think about any distinguishing characteristic. I mentioned that I was a trainer before taking this position. I used to teach dispatchers specifically, detention officers, law enforcement officers, but I remember one class I was mentioning entering a stolen vehicle in this case. And we asked the same thing, what makes that vehicle stand out? And I had a dispatcher kind of sheepishly raise her hand and say that she had baling wire and duct tape holding her bumper together. Well, it may look a little unsightly in the parking lot, but honestly, that is a fantastic piece of identifying information. If I look for the Toyota RAV4 that's got duct tape and baling wire holding her bumper on, I know exactly which vehicle that is. And the same applies for missing persons, so it's something to think about. Other things, and this really pertains to children, but it can pertain to adults. If the missing person has any kind of social media accounts, know which apps they use, know what social media apps they use, and then what their account information is. If you're a parent, make sure that you know what apps your children are using. I think it's harder and harder nowadays, but kind of be up on it. You'll hear, I believe, later this week, tomorrow, I believe, about some information for human trafficking and kind of internet crimes against children. Make sure that you know what apps they use. Make sure you have their passwords. Make sure you know their usernames. There's a lot of great information from that. Same thing with any of their belongings. I don't know how many kids have a diary anymore or a journal, but if they have some personal belongings, tablets, cell phones, journals, things like that, save that for law enforcement. There's a lot of information they should be able to glean from it, hopefully, to help identify. Like I said, for the most part, this pertains to children, but it can pertain to adults too. After the report, this is probably the hardest part. This has always been the hardest part when I speak to families. And this is definitely the hardest part when trying to kind of grasp in your own world, you know, how to deal with a missing person. The biggest thing is, I can't tell you not to panic. I can't tell you that everything's going to be fantastic. But I can say there's a couple of things you can do as you're hanging up these phone calls and done speaking to the officer or dispatch. One, by far, get good contact information for the law enforcement officer who's investigating your missing person case. Get their name, get their phone number, badge number. Also I mentioned that a call for service or a CAD report would be created when you speak to dispatch. Get the CAD number. Think of that CAD number, CAD number, as a reference number for your call. I attended a training, I want to say about 2 weeks ago, and it was a human trafficking training where a family had a family member that was human trafficked, and they got her out of the life, and they're kind of slowly rebuilding their relationship. They lived in a big city, and she probably made 10 calls to law enforcement. And each time she called law enforcement, at least the first 3 or 4 times, she was given a different CAD number, a reference number, because each time it was treated like a new call. So one of the things that will help you guys is if you're reporting a loved one missing, get the same CAD number so you can say, hey, here's the reference number for my missing sister. Here's the information I have. Here's new information. So I would say get good contact information from the law enforcement officer. Get a good reference number for the call that your missing loved one is involved with. Another step, because like I said, waiting is hard, is to start writing down everything that you mentioned. Write down the steps you've taken, the people you've talked to, the phone numbers you talked to them on, the times, and what information did you provide to them? Did you say, hey, I have an update. I just checked so-and-so's Facebook status and she said this, this, and this. If that's the case, write it down, mention who you talked to. Yes, it helps take your mind off things, but more importantly, it can help you remember things. Maybe there were details you didn't remember to give in the first place. So I think there's a lot of benefit in trying to slow down a little bit and then kind of jotting down everything. Yesterday, I had a meeting with a couple other clearinghouse managers from other states. Those are folks that do kind of the same job that I do. And once again, we had another survivor. In this case, it wasn't a human trafficking survivor, but it was a missing person that was called in by this loved one. And they said the biggest thing they wish they did was actually writing things down, because they talked to so many different officers and so many different dispatchers during a 4-month missing person investigation that they couldn't keep anything straight. I think it helps if you can kind of focus your notes and write down who you've talked to and why. Another thing that, and I'll mention this later on, but confirm with your local law enforcement that they are entering your missing loved one into the National Crime Information Center, NCIC, database of missing persons. That's an FBI-held database, and I'll talk about reporting standards in a little bit, but that's an FBI database for law enforcement of missing persons. So that if a law enforcement officer is in North Dakota and they run your loved one's driver's license or missing, say they run a child's information through this database, they'll actually get a hit back. So I live in Broadwater County. If I go missing and my wife reports me missing, she'll talk to the Broadwater County Sheriff's Office and they will enter me into NCIC. If I turn up even in Florida and somebody runs me, my name, sex, date of birth, they'll actually get a little notification that says, hey, there's an active missing persons investigation out of Broadwater County. Contact this number, contact this agency. So even though, you know, it seems kind of minuscule and I've kind of been told that, well, they just got put in a database. There's more to it than just being put in a database. This database has millions of law enforcement officers that can access this. So it is important, and it is one of the things that we look for from our clearinghouse perspective to make sure that law enforcement agencies are doing. Another thing to do, and I'll mention this in a little bit, is visit our clearinghouse website. So what we do in Montana is anytime a law enforcement agency submits a missing person report to this FBI database, we actually take a copy of it. We strip out all the law enforcement sensitive information because we don't want to embarrass missing persons. We just want them found. And then we publish that information on our website. So if you see your missing loved one on the website, it means law enforcement did enter them in the database and there is an active missing person case for them. I mentioned before, and I always hate it when sometimes you hear dispatchers or you hear like a previous 911 call on the news and they always say, well, don't panic, but the key is you really probably will panic, and there's not really a lot of avoiding that. But what I will say is don't lose hope. Luckily, missing persons cases are resolved all the time. Yesterday, we had a youth that's been missing since April of last year, and he's been gone for almost exactly a year. He would have been a year and 2 weeks, but he turned up yesterday. You just don't lose hope. It does happen, and you'll hear the statistics later on, but you know, stick with it. Focus your attention on something positive, and I think it'll help. So our DOJ missing persons website has a lot of great information. One, like I just mentioned, it has all active missing person case data in there. It also has a data study, the 2017 to 2019 data study that was performed by Montana DOJ. You'll hear some pieces of that from Tina a little later, but our website does have that information in case you want to see the full report on it. We also will list all missing children. We'll actually have a PDF file where you can have all missing children available to kind of share with your schools. There's also a PDF file with all missing children and their photos if we have them. So there is a lot of benefit to visiting it. If you do go to our website, you'll see this box here that's kind of in the lower middle of the screen. It says Missing Persons Clearinghouse Start Search. When you do that and you click Start Search, it'll bring you to another web page. A tab will open up and it lets you search through all of our active missing persons. So you have a couple different options. The screenshot to the left shows home, search all missing persons, and search all missing children. If you click search all missing persons, it'll bring up the entire list of missing persons. It'll have little details in there. So if you look on the right side, you'll see it's alphabetical order. You'll have alias names if they have it, name, sex, date of birth. It'll give the date of last contact. I mentioned that's pretty important. And also the investigating law enforcement agency for that missing person case. So if you click on that, search all missing persons, you'll see everybody. If you do search all missing children, you'll get everybody between 0 and 18. And you can also do an advanced search or a quick search if there's a specific person you're looking for. When you do see them, you can actually click on the name and then you'll get a little bit further details. But we will just basically, we sort out the law enforcement sensitive information. We're not going to mention that somebody suffers from schizophrenia or that they're possibly suicidal. That's not the purpose of this website. It's to help identify and find missing persons. So I do think that's a pretty valuable tool. Okay. That's kind of alerting or at least notifying law enforcement in a nutshell about missing persons. I hope that was fairly clear. That's a ton of information. A lot of it's stuff you may not know right off the bat, but it's stuff you guys can be thinking about and information you can share with law enforcement. As far as database entry goes, there's actually only 9 data fields that law enforcement needs to get a missing person entered into the database. So really name, sex, date of birth, height, weight, physicals, things like that. That's about it. There's not a lot of data, but a lot of this additional data that I mentioned really helps get people in the system. So I want to move a little bit onto alerts. There are 3 different alerts.
Before you do that, you said you wanted interactive questions if they came up. Is that still true?
Sure. What do you have, David?
So just thinking about this kid that showed up after a year on the missing persons list, does going missing apply to the sort of new right to be forgotten thing? I mean, when that kid turns 18 or 21 or whatever it is, will he be able to wipe the records of his former missingness in order not to be stigmatized or have any adult records of that? Or is that on his permanent record for the rest of his life?
That's a good question, David. So the database will hold on to archived information. We can tell, okay, this juvenile went missing at this time, they were found at this time. But we don't, it's not like if 10 years down the road they're run by law enforcement, whether they check their criminal history, whether they check even just a driver's license check, none of that information is going to be present. So even a criminal history check on them, it's not going to say, hey, this person went missing 15 years ago. The only way you would know that data is actually if you queried, if somebody at Department of Justice queried old data. So it's not released to the public. It's not even released to additional law enforcement agencies. That would be a historical database search that it wouldn't be present otherwise. So it's not something that somebody would see.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. For public alerts, we do issue public alerts at the Department of Justice level. There's a couple things I want to mention. This is good for all 3 of the alerts that we do. The biggest purpose of an alert is to ask for the public's assistance in locating a missing person. We will say, hey, members of the public, help us find this missing person. Or in the case of a blue alert, a suspect that is hurt or killed a law enforcement officer. But really we're asking for public assistance. 2, the request does have to come from law enforcement. There has to be some sort of vetting process for these alerts. We don't want, a domestic violence situation where the husband calls up and says, hey, Montana Department of Justice, my wife went missing, help me find her. And she's not missing, she's running away. There's a big difference. So there is a vetting process for this. And then additionally, alerts typically expire within 24 hours. So if we launch an alert at the Department of Justice, that will expire in 24 hours unless new additional information is present. That doesn't mean people stop caring. It doesn't mean law enforcement stops looking. But the purpose of the alert is to say, hey, public, help us find this missing person. After 24 hours, it's kind of done its job. Alerts are just kind of one cog in the big wheel of missing persons and investigations. So that's kind of a generic statement about alerts. But I do want to kind of dispel myths and explain the process about alerts. So the first one and the most visible alert that we do is called an Amber Alert. I imagine everybody's familiar with an Amber Alert, probably in the audience. With an Amber Alert, we have very specific criteria. All of the criteria have to be met, and then we will issue one. There has to be reasonable belief that by law enforcement, that the child's been abducted or has disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Really, we look for abduction. These are for child abductions. Not only that, but we also look for endangerment. Law enforcement has to believe the child's in imminent danger of serious bodily injury or death. They also have to be a child. They've got to be somebody 17 years or younger, or have a proven mental disability that kind of has them functioning at a younger age. And then lastly, there has to be enough descriptive information about the victim and the abduction situation that we can ask for the public's help. If we don't have hardly any information, then it doesn't benefit anybody for us to say, hey, public, help us find really nothing. We don't have much on it. So there does have to be enough information to request public assistance. With Amber Alerts, we use a ton of resources. We have a lot of great partners here in Montana that really help us with Amber Alerts. So I'll just kind of go through it quick. Montana Department of Transportation, as you saw on the last slide, they will fix their road signs to show the Amber Alert. Their 511 phone number, which is one of the most popular phone numbers in state government, that's the road conditions phone number. We'll play the Amber Alert message before you get road conditions. The National Weather Service will broadcast this message. The Public Broadcasters Association's been fantastic. What we do is when we launch an alert, we also attach a poster and send that to the Public Broadcasters Association. So you will automatically see it in the news because they've been fantastic and they're on it about trying to help find a child. Montana Lottery, as you saw in the last slide, I'll go back to it real quick. The lottery will actually publish information about an Amber Alert on their lottery tickets. They'll also publish a poster on some of their self-serving kiosks. So if your guys' towns have a Montana Lottery kiosk where you can buy lottery tickets automated, it'll actually broadcast that Amber Alert before you can even buy your tickets. The Department of Justice webpage also has Amber Alert information. That's something that you guys will see recent alerts, and you can click on the poster and see the information that we have that we're putting out there. And then lastly, and probably the most audible or visible part of an Amber Alert, we use a product called Code Red. And Code Red is an application that we can sign into via a website, and we can get into the Integrated Public Alert Warning System. It's called IPAWS. What that is it's something that FEMA created or FEMA administers, and it allows us to launch a wireless emergency alert. That's the sound you hear on your cell phone, and that's the information that you guys get, that little blip about an Amber Alert. It's called a WIA alert, and it's through IPAWS. Some of the questions we get on Amber Alerts when we do issue them is why don't we have a lot of information? And through IPAWS and WIA, we are only allowed 90 characters up until last year. So 90 characters, if you guys are frequent texters, you know there's not hardly any information you can include in 90 characters. So we were limited to that. Recently, within the last year and a half, carriers have started upgrading so that now we can broadcast 360 characters. So what we do on our level is we actually broadcast a message in 90 and we broadcast a message in 360. So that if you have an older phone, it may get the 90. If you have a newer phone, but your carrier hasn't upgraded, you still may get the 90. But you can also, if you have a newer phone on a carrier that's already upgraded, you can get 360 full characters of information. So sometimes we get a lot of questions about why don't we have a lot of info. That's actually where it comes from. The second alert that we do is a missing endangered person advisory. It's called a MIPA. For a MIPA, it's kind of like a mini Amber Alert. If a law enforcement agency calls us and says, hey, Brian, you know, we've got a missing kid. I don't know that there's abduction. Here's the situation. What we do is we see if it meets Amber Alert criteria first. If it does, we will launch an Amber Alert. If it doesn't, we'll go down to a MIPA and say, okay, if it doesn't meet an Amber Alert, does it meet these criteria? So a MIPA can be for any person of any age. Doesn't matter if they're a child, doesn't matter if they're an adult. But they've had to be missing under unexplained, involuntary, or suspicious circumstances. This has been dementia patients that have walked away from nursing homes. This has been children that are believed to be, I wouldn't say abducted, but I would say that have gone swimming and haven't returned. Possible drowning victims, basically anything that have some sort of endangerment and they've gone missing. So if we launch that alert, we're still asking for public assistance saying, hey, help us find them, but that's kind of the basis for it. There also has to be enough information to assist in the recovery of that missing person. So it's very similar to an Amber Alert, but we have a little bit looser criteria so that we can still issue this alert. Some states, if you guys are from out of state, you'll see Washington will have something called the Silver Alert. Colorado does something very similar. They're all similar in the nature of their alerts, but for us, we kind of have a catch-all so that we can do a person of any age that meets these criteria. For resources and how it works, if we launch an Amber Alert, we typically launch it statewide. We're saying, hey, everybody in the state of Montana, we are all fantastic, and we love our communities, we know our communities, help us find this missing child that's been abducted. For a MIPA, we can do it a little bit more localized. So if we've got somebody who's walked away from a nursing home, say here in Lewis and Clark County, we might issue a MIPA for Lewis and Clark and Jefferson if they're on the south end, just because there's a lot of overlap. But we can do it by county, we can do it by groups of counties, we can do it surrounding counties, we can do all of eastern Montana, all of western Montana. It can be more localized. They do use a lot less resources in an Amber Alert. We're not going to wake ping your cell phones at 3 a.m. For a MIPA. The biggest resource we see that's used is the Public Broadcasters Association. Typically, if we launch a MIPA, they get a copy of it, and then you'll see it in the news pretty shortly afterwards. They've been awesome about it, but that's frequently how the information is spread. The last alert that we have is blue alerts. This is used in the case of if a peace officer has gone missing within their official job duties and it's been suspicious, we can issue a blue alert. We can also issue a blue alert if an officer has been killed or seriously wounded in the line of duty and the suspect is at large. We tie it a little bit to missing persons because if an officer is missing, we can launch it. But basically, a blue alert is usually for an officer who's been hurt or killed in the line of duty and the suspect is at large. And the blue alert will use the same exact resources as an Amber Alert, so your cell phones will go off. You'll get that WIA emergency alert. So just kind of as a heads up, thankfully we don't use these very frequently. Thankfully you don't use Amber Alerts very frequently, but we do have those tools accessible if we need them. Okay, that's about it for at least reporting a missing person and understanding public alerts. Like I said, I know it's a lot of information. I think it's good information, it's good things to know, but it is a lot of information. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about how did we get here? What are some of the rules and guidelines about missing persons? So in 2018, the State Tribal Relations Subcommittee, they started looking at missing persons going, well, what's going on with missing persons? We hear an awful lot about it. Are there shortcomings? Are there things that are working? Are there gaps? What's going on? So they met with members of the Attorney General's office, DOJ staff here at the state level, and they really identified some gaps in reporting, and the lawmakers solidified, or at least what was perceived to be gaps, and I think that they did a fantastic job. So out of the 2019 legislative session, after those meetings in 2018, they crafted a series of bills to kind of help fill the gaps for missing person reporting. One of the ones I'll mention is House Bill 20. Basically, historically, law enforcement viewed custodial interference as kind of hands-off. It said, okay, that's a civil issue, not really a criminal justice issue. But looking at custodial interference and how damaging it can be to families, this law was crafted. And what it basically states is if custodial interference is believed to be occurring by the law enforcement agency, they have to get good detailed information for everybody involved. Where are they living? Who's all there? Addresses, phone numbers, things like that. If, and this is the big one for missing persons, if they believe custodial interference is taking place and they can't locate the child, they can't make sure the child's okay, they don't know where they are, then they must treat it like a missing person. So they need to enter the child as missing. They need to basically treat it exactly like a missing juvenile. House Bill 21, this one's also known as Hannah's Act. This one basically created a position within the Department of Justice. It's the position I hold now. It's the missing person specialist job. They looked at it and said, well, there really isn't anybody dedicated to missing persons at the state level, and it's true. My agency is the Criminal Justice Information Network. We're also the Missing Persons Clearinghouse. But for a long time, missing persons, it's kind of other duties as assigned to a certain extent. And we're all very passionate about missing persons, but it was in addition to the other duties that we were doing. So as a training officer, I taught concealed weapons permits and warrants and how to run a driver's license and how to run registration checks and how to do missing persons, how to enter missing persons, what information is needed, but it was in addition to the other duties that I was doing. So Misty LaPlante had taken the position originally. She left and I've applied for it and I do hold that position. The biggest thing with my job is to act as a liaison and to a certain extent an advocate for missing persons and their families. So if you have a loved one that has gone missing, you are having a hard time with law enforcement, or maybe you're not using the right language, I'm happy to speak on your behalf to law enforcement. But really I act as a liaison between families and law enforcement. I do provide guidance and support to both law enforcement and families. I oversee all missing person entries into the databases. So I'm the clearinghouse manager, meaning that I look at our Montana specific clearinghouse, as well as overseeing all database entries into the federal FBI database. I do provide public outreach and education, which probably today. And then we try to facilitate training to law enforcement agencies as well. COVID has kind of put a damper on some things, but really we had an awful lot of virtual meetings last year, and I hope that continues this year and kind of things get better, but that's the missing person specialist. House Bill 54, this is probably one of the most important bills out of the 2019 legislative session that also popped up. What it did was it changed reporting standards. We did not have any laws on the books for missing adults at all. after this session, we did. So basically it said, if somebody calls up law enforcement and reports a loved one missing, that law enforcement agency must take a missing persons report. If they don't, they must ensure another law enforcement agency is doing that. We want to make sure nobody fights that jurisdictional nightmare of, well, I called them and they said they can't help me, so I called this agency and they said they can't help me, and you kind of go round robin. The buck has to stop somewhere, and that was the purpose of this bill. Additionally, it also said, if you've got a missing person over the age of 21, they must be entered into the database, the FBI database, within 8 hours. David, you had mentioned that, you know, kind of hands off, you have the right to be missing, and it's true. So they've looked at 8 hours and said, okay, if you're reporting a missing loved one, yeah, they've got some time to turn up, but our goal isn't to embarrass somebody. We just want to make sure, hey, are they okay? I can say from my experience, my very first missing or hit in the entire Siegen system when I was a dispatcher at Highway Patrol 11 and a half years ago was actually a missing person hit. It was an elderly gentleman out of Florida who purposely drove to Montana and wanted to be left alone by his family. And law enforcement ran him, got this missing person hit. We contacted the Florida police agency and said, yeah, we have him. What's going on? Well, the family was just concerned. Like, well, he's okay. We can confirm he's okay, but they should not be telling the family any more than that, because he was in a situation where he's fine. He has his faculties. It's hands off. We just confirmed he's okay. And that's something.
Yeah, one of my most sort of personal experiences with this whole process happened back in California about, I want to say 15 years ago, when an old college buddy went missing, and a number of us were asked to help, right? I mean, just because we had, you know, past acquaintances, past relationships. Eventually he was found, and one of the most frustrating things was that there was absolutely no one, I think by design, who would share with us what his disposition was, because I guess he was just not wanting to be found. So we were like, what happened to him? No one would tell us.
You ride that fine line between privacy concerns and just trying to help. So that is exactly what happened in this case. We found the gentleman, he's okay. We reported that to the investigating law enforcement agency. They were good, and then we kind of move on. Now, House Bill 54 did not change youth reporting standards. So we've always said anybody under the age of 21, they have to be entered within 2 hours. That was already state statute, and that's also federal statute. So those did not change. But for adults, we actually have reporting standards. If you look at other states' laws, many states do not have any kind of reporting time for adults. Last one I'll mention, and I'll turn it over to Tina because she said I've talked plenty today. Senate Bill 40. This is one that's not really reported a whole lot. At least I don't see a lot of articles on it, but it's a fantastic bill that passed in the 2019 legislative session. Senate Bill 40 required the Office of Public Instruction, OPI, to create and maintain a database of school photos for children. And it said, okay, we're going to give Department of Justice staff access to this database so that if we have missing children, school-age children, we can get into that database and grab photos. And I mentioned before that school photos aren't ideal, and it's true, but at least it's something. It helps us identify missing persons and hopefully find them. So I looked yesterday, and we had 28,169 school pictures in that database. So it is growing. I think COVID kind of put a damper on things. The biggest thing with this is it's opt-in. So those of you guys that are parents, you should be getting something from the school each school year that says, hey, if your child ever goes missing, do you allow access to their photo for use in missing person cases? It's the only reason we access it, but if you guys do get that, please fill it out and send it back. It's an opt-in program, so you have to get that signed, otherwise we can't use their photos and we don't see them. Okay. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Tina because this has a lot to do with what she does. Yes, ma'am.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
What about kids that are homeschooled as far as a picture in this database?
So I can't say I'm an expert on who has access to the OPI database in terms of how that works. I don't believe they are in there. Okay. But I can say if a homeschool child goes missing, I would hope that the parents can easily provide a photo from their cell phone. These photos are mostly used when we can't get a picture. Law enforcement can't find them. It's a great question, but law enforcement can't find them. Maybe they're in foster care and they don't have any recent photos of them. Okay. Those are probably the biggest use we see for those photos, but I would hope that at least that the parents would be like, okay, I've got 5,670 photos of my child. My wife does. I know my wife does. I've got like 1,000. She has 5 times what I have. So, but it's a great question.
Okay, yeah, I was just wondering if there was a way that you could opt in, you know, to offer pictures.
Not that I'm aware of. I can't.
Okay.
I won't lie and say that you can't, but I don't. Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you.
Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Tina because, like I said, she's probably tired of me talking.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate it. So I am going to continue 2019 legislation and tell you a little bit about Senate Bill 312. Senate Bill 312 established the Looping in Native Communities Act, and there were two primary things that came out of that act: to create a missing Indigenous persons task force and to create a Looping in Native Communities Network grant program. And so the task force has some very specific duties in the statute, that they would administer the LINK grant network, or excuse me, the LINK grant, that they would work to identify barriers that people encounter. And these barriers can be in jurisdictions, between federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement, and between community agencies. So once they've identified those barriers, then they're tasked with identifying strategies to improve interagency communication, collaboration, and try to remove those barriers so that we can have increased reporting and investigation of missing persons. The LINK Network grant program is to support efforts of Montana tribes to identify and find and report, specifically reporting Native Americans who are missing. Next.
There's a little bit of lag, I'm pretty sure. Can you see it?
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So the bill didn't require a person in a specific position like Brian's position, but I was hired by Department of Justice to be the Looping in Native Communities Coordinator. And there's three primary things that I do. I staff the Montana Missing Indigenous Persons Task Force, and they are made up of tribal leaders, state and federal leaders, and state agencies who are working together to improve that communication in these missing person cases. The second thing I do is I administer the Looping in Native Communities grant program, and that provided a grant to a Montana tribal college to develop a missing Indigenous persons website and database to specifically improve reporting and tracking in Native communities. And the third thing I do is track all of the information that we receive through the work of the task force and through the Looping in Native Communities grant, and combine that into a report to the State Tribal Relations Committee. So if you're interested in that, that's available on the DOJ website, and there's a lot of data in there. And I'll cover a little bit of that today. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is the Montana Missing Indigenous Persons Task Force. They have a logo, and you can see it here. And then just a picture of one of our in-person meetings in Billings last February. Unfortunately, we haven't had an in-person meeting since last February. It's hard to believe that. So like I said, the task force was established by the legislature. It's now in state code at MCA 442411. The members are appointed by the Attorney General and include the eight tribes, so that each tribe is recognized or is recognized by somebody on the task force. And then Montana Highway Patrol, someone from the Attorney General's office, and the Montana Department of Justice expert in missing persons, who is our Brian Frost. And during the task force's first 2 or 3 meetings, they decided that it would be very helpful to include somebody from Indian Health Services and from the U.S. Attorney's Office to give additional perspectives. So one of the first things that we needed to do was really go out and listen to communities and understand what families experienced when they had a missing person or a missing loved one. You can see here the listing of where we went in 2019 into early 2020. We were not able to hit all of the tribal reservations, unfortunately. They were on our schedule, and then COVID kind of put everything to a stop. But we are looking forward to resuming those meetings, hopefully this summer. Something else that we're working on is really trying to reduce barriers to reporting missing Native Americans. And so what we've come up with are some strategies to address that. Providing computer access in a central location and a phone number for a link coordinator, somebody similar to me, but that would really be knowledgeable about the tribal community that they live in, somebody that would be available to assist family members with reporting a loved one missing, somebody that maybe could reach out and get referrals or provide the family referrals to other services. The website that we are going to talk about is also going to provide easier reporting. And Brian, can you go back for a second?
Sorry about that.
Thank you. Easier reporting through this website. It's the first one in the state that we have that people can access specifically for this purpose. And we can ensure that law enforcement is notified through automatic alerts that come from the website. And then we ensure that family is notified that law enforcement received that alert. Thanks, Brian. So this is a page on the website. It gives a little bit of information about the project. It really started with a passionate person up in the Blackfeet area named Drew Landry. He works for Blackfeet Community College. And the task force awarded a grant to Blackfeet Community College to kind of pick up where he had left off. He had started designing his own website and just didn't have the capacity and the time to really work as much on it as he wanted to. He was also really moved by Ashley Loring's disappearance and worked really hard with the family and her friends to look for her. And it moved him so much that he just was dedicated to working on this issue. So the web address is mmipmt.com. I do want to mention that we are using MMIP, and the terminology for that it kind of falls with the MMIW, but there are distinctions between MMIW and MMIP here in Montana. So MMIW, nationally, we've been tracking it and watching the awareness grow over the last few years. MMIW generally means murdered and missing Indigenous women. And sometimes you'll see MMIWG, so that also includes girls. In Montana, MMIP is the Montana Missing Indigenous Persons. So right now, we're not really able to address many of the murdered Indigenous persons here in Montana, but we are moving in that direction. And I think the work that the task force is doing, the data that's being gathered, and the entries into this website will really help push us into a direction where we can learn more about unresolved cases. So
Hey, Tina?
Yes.
I'm not sure I understood that last point at all. Are you saying that MMIP is not about finding murdered and Indigenous persons?
It is, but I just wanted to make a distinction that it's just in a slightly different use here in our state. We will be entering Indigenous persons that have been murdered that we know about. I think right now there's not a whole lot of information about that in Montana. We have an idea of how many from our missing persons clearinghouse may have been found deceased, but we aren't sure how many there are. And I think one of the functions of this website is to really find out truly how many persons have been missing and have been gone for a long time and may be presumed deceased.
So over time, you're saying that the two acronyms should be the same.
Eventually, I would imagine they will.
And if I were to, or are we entitled to ask or learn somehow what the gender makeup of the persons are? I mean, are there 99% females in this missing database and 1% male, or is it 50-50?
Yeah.
How do we go about answering a question like that?
Oh yeah, and I will answer that here.
You're jumping the gun, David.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll hold the question.
You're good. You're good. I appreciate the questions. It is a lot to consider in the big picture of missing persons in Montana, and specifically missing Indigenous persons in Montana. And we're just really at the very beginning of this endeavor to do a deep dive into understanding how many are missing, how long they've been missing, and trying to break down barriers so that everybody is kind of on the same page about how to respond. So in going back to the reporting on the website.
Tina,
Yes.
sorry, just one second. There was one other question from a few minutes ago. Someone asked, what is considered a Native community?
In this case, we are calling the reservations Native communities, but we also recognize that 70% of Indigenous people live off reservation. And so there's also areas called urban Indian areas in Billings, in Helena, Great Falls, Butte, and Missoula. And so we anticipate that it wouldn't just be reservations, but it would also be urban Indian areas. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you.
Are there any others right now that need to be answered?
That's all that's in the chat right now.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So what the legislature wanted was an easy way for Native American families to report a missing person without necessarily having to go directly to law enforcement. And that can be for a variety of reasons. Sometimes for some families, going to law enforcement is a barrier for reporting a missing loved one. And so the idea was that, and it's in statute, that there would be a website developed for the purpose of reporting that families could use, and that when they submit a report of a missing person, it would go automatically to a law enforcement agency, and that law enforcement agency would be alerted. The additional steps in this process is that we will have a link coordinator who's going to follow up on every single one of the reports in this website. And they will then follow up with law enforcement to make sure law enforcement received the report. And then they will go back to the family and let the family know that law enforcement has been notified. Couple of things, some of the information that you may submit on the website may be duplicative, and it may be exactly the same information that law enforcement wants when an official report is made. And the reason I'm saying an official report is law enforcement is going to require a couple of more physical indicators, I guess, than what we are required to have on our website. And really, a report to law enforcement is what starts the steps of finding a missing person. So as Brian said, you have to get in touch with 911 or a local law enforcement agency to begin that process. So a person's going to go to the website. They're going to enter information about the missing person. It's fairly clear to see that, and I'll show you what the form looks like on the next slide. But once people complete this form, then you click continue. You're entering names, nickname if you have it, birth date, race, tribal affiliation if you know it, their gender, and then any other physical characteristics like height, weight, scars, marks, where the person was last seen and who the person was seen with, if they know that, the date of the last contact that you had when you saw this person, and then an email address so that we can get back in touch with you. So we have tried to make this form as simple as possible. And you'll notice that we have language here that says reports of Montana missing Indigenous persons on this website will only go to Blackfeet Law Enforcement Services. That's because right now we're in the first stage of rolling out the website, and we have a second version of the website that's in development, and that version will include the ability to make a report with any reservation to any law enforcement agency that's on or near the tribal reservations. Okay. So I want to take a step back and talk about the data that also kind of led to the website and understanding what information we're going to get and what we really need. So as Brian said, he manages the Clearinghouse, and there was a project that began in early 2019 to really try to figure out how many people have been missing and to break down the numbers and try to identify some interesting observations, I guess. So I was incorrect. This study was done in early 2020. So we looked at over 5,500 entries over a 3-year period from 2017 to 2019. To our knowledge, nobody else in the United States has done
medicines, opiates, and even alcohol.
Nobody has done a really deep dive into data analysis like we have. So it was really interesting. We had 5,567 entries, and you can see where they're broken down by year, 17, 18, and 19, and that the entries increase over time. I can say that in 2020, the number is almost exactly what we had in 2019. We needed to understand how many unique individuals were in this data. And so it makes sense that there would be a lot of people in here, but there's also a lot of people that go missing more than one time. And so these 3,254 individuals are identified as unique. Some of them may be entered over that 3-year period more than one time because they went missing more than one time. It could be a juvenile, it could be an adult, but they were reported to law enforcement as missing at least one time. What we were really surprised to find was how many of these people in 2017 to 19 in the database were juveniles under the age of 18. We had 80% of our missing persons that are under the age of 18. Which was just mind-blowing. I don't think any of us expected to see that. People that are really watching the Clearinghouse maybe could kind of glean that over time, but this was really the first time we had tried to figure out what the data represents. Of those under the age of 18, we had 2,622 under 18, and then we had 632 over 18. So you can see that's a really big difference. We also looked at how many were going missing more than one time. 60% of those that went missing more than one time were juveniles. So we had 954 individuals that went missing more than once, were reported to law enforcement missing, and then we had 572 that were under the age of 18. So it was just really fascinating to see what the data told us. like Brian mentioned earlier, the rate that people are located and recovered is really high in Montana, and I think that is something that people should be aware of. Law enforcement is locating these people, they're recovered, or the people are returning on their own at a really high rate. And so I think you can see that as a mode of success. At the end of 2019, on the very last day of the year, we knew that there were 147 people missing. And we'll come back to that in just a minute. I included a map of the Montana reservations so you can see how large of an area these reservations cover and how close some of them are to large population areas. And so the top 10 counties, you're good, Brian, you can go to the next one. Top 10 counties for unique individuals going missing over this 3-year period was really interesting. We knew that Yellowstone County was going to be pretty high. Flathead, Missoula, Lewis and Clark, and Gallatin are all on here because, and it makes sense because they have the highest population. But what we weren't aware of was how many counties that include reservation areas would be on here for in the top 10. So reservation boundaries for the Crow, the Northern Cheyenne, the Little Shell, and the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes are all within or bordering most of these counties. And I think that's important to note. So we did an overall view of what the missing persons list told us, all races. And then we started looking at it and breaking it down by race. And so because I'm the link person, I'm really focused on looking at Indigenous people that go missing. And so I wanted to kind of break it down for you today and tell you a little bit more about what we've seen and learned over the last 3 years. So Native Americans go missing 4 times more likely than white people. So in the graph here, you see the blue area, that is Caucasian white people broken down by race. They represented 67% of the overall number of individuals. In the gray, that represents the Indigenous people that have gone missing, 840. While 26% doesn't seem, no, that's not what I want to say. 67% seems about right for missing white people. But then we were curious about why there would be so many, 1/4 of this representing Indigenous people. So by race, you can see 26% of the overall unique individuals were Native American. And when Brian and I do our meetings for the task force, the MMIP task force, we present information on the current missing Indigenous persons. And every month, it's very consistent, 25 to 30% of the missing persons are made up by Native Americans. It's very consistent. Something that we noticed when looking overall at all races and then comparing just Indigenous people, if you're looking at all races, males and females tend to go missing equally. But if you're looking at Indigenous missing people, females go missing 1.5 times more often than males do. The average age of missing Indigenous people is 17. So they are under that, they are under the age of 18. For the remainder of the races, the average age is about 15.
So Tina, on that last slide, is there a word missing in the 4th bullet? Did you mean to say Indigenous females are 1.5 times more likely? Because all it says is females.
Yes, well, this slide says Indigenous missing persons at the top.
Oh, I see. Okay, I got it. All of these statistics are relative to Indigenous.
Yes.
So it's 60-40. If I do the math right, that means it's about 60-40 female?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So we did a hotspot map of all of the missing persons, and that was really interesting. And then I decided to do a map of just the missing Indigenous only, and it kind of confirms those counties that were located in the top 10 list. You can see Yellowstone has the highest number of missing Indigenous people during this 3-year period, followed by Bighorn County. Bighorn County is has Crow Nation in their boundary. Rosebud County has Northern Cheyenne in that county. The other counties over here on the left that you see, Lewis and Clark, Cascade, and Lake, also have the highest numbers of missing Indigenous. Lake County is going to have CSKT and part of Flathead County as well. Lewis and Clark and Cascade really aren't near a reservation, but we do know that the Little Shell tribe is in Great Falls. And so there could be quite a lot of members of the Little Shell tribe that live in this area as well. And then you can see there aren't very many larger numbers on the remaining counties.
So Tina, when you did these numbers, the Little Shell was not federally recognized, correct?
They are now, and they will be reflected in the 2021 data.
Okay.
And they've been state recognized. It's just the feds that did not recognize them. However, when we look at law enforcement agencies that enter records for missing persons, Little Shell would be the only group that does not have access because they don't have a consolidated police force. They don't really have a set reservation boundary. So they don't have a police force to enter records. So typically if it's a Little Shell member that's gone missing around Great Falls area, chances are it'd be Great Falls PD or Cascade County that would enter them as a missing person.
With a tribal affiliation saying Little Shell in the record?
For the database itself, the federal database does not currently, I know there's talk about expanding it. They have races, but they only have Indigenous persons. It doesn't specialize tribal affiliation.
I see. Thanks.
So there was a question, Brian, about Rocky Boy and Fort Belknap.
Okay. So Rocky Boy and Fort Belknap are both on the system. They both have now access to it. So 2 years ago, 2.5, Rocky Boy gained access to the Criminal Justice Information Network. We at the state level treat all tribes the same as any other law enforcement agency. So in their case, it was just a matter of making sure they had an encrypted connection and making sure they jumped through the right hoops because they're accessing FBI data. But they have the ability to enter, remove, query your records just as any law enforcement agency, whether it's Missoula PD or Blaine County or Rocky Boy PD. Fort Belknap was in the similar boat. They started to jump online. They had some issues jumping through the security hoops, and they are now online as of, I believe, February. So between February and March, they jumped online and now they have access. Now, just because they didn't have access before didn't mean they didn't get the information. They just had to get it from another agency. So if you were Fort Belknap, you would call Blaine County and Blaine County would enter your missing persons. They would give you responses back from the network. But now they actually have direct access instead of secondary access, so to speak.
So this next slide is, again, focusing on missing Indigenous people. But this is like the number of days that they were missing. So you can identify the number of days that people will go missing. It may not be 100% accurate because some people may go missing and be missing 2 or 3 weeks before they're actually reported to law enforcement. But we are going by the date the report was made to law enforcement and the date that they are cleared or located by law enforcement. So
I was just going to say, in the database, we have actually 3 options for removing a missing person record. The first one would be located. That would mean, so if I go missing in Broadwater County and I am found in Flathead County, through the database, Flathead County will place what they call a locate transaction, meaning, hey, we found your missing person in the system. If that happens, that means that record is automatically removed from the missing person system. Another one would be cleared. That would be in the case I go missing from Broadwater County. I'm found within Broadwater County by a deputy. They check my status. Hey, are you okay? You going through anything? What's up? And then I say, no, I'm fine. I'm just rolling through a rough patch or whatever the case may be. Because there's been law enforcement action taken, I've had some sort of communication with them, they will clear the record. The flip side of that would be a cancel. And where a cancel would come into place is an invalid record, meaning I walk away from Broadwater County, my wife reports me missing to Broadwater County. My wife calls back 2 hours later and says, oh no, he was just an overdue motorist, he had a flat tire, he's back home now, he's safe. If there's no law enforcement action taken, we would cancel that record. And that's kind of the difference between the three. The end result is the same. The missing person's found, but we do define how that works differently.
So all the numbers on this slide, Brian, are referring to found alive.
These would be found, period. The database itself does not reflect how people are found. It reflects whether they are missing and then whether they are found, not the status of how they're found.
Or their status as, you know, existing persons, right, that have not been murdered.
No, the database itself is missing persons. So we keep track at the Clearinghouse section of if they went missing, they were entered, they were found. Their status of whether they were found alive, whether they were found hurt, whether they were found perfectly fine or deceased doesn't change how the database reflects it. So this total would reflect people that are found deceased, people that are found alive, and maybe people that were found going through some mental trauma.
Okay, thanks.
So this chart shows you the percentage of days missing for Indigenous missing people, and it's broken down into 0 days. So somebody that was found, located, or returned within less than 24 hours. 1 to 7 days is after 24 hours up through the 7th day. 8 to 30 days is the next section. 31 to 365 days is next. And then we've got after 365 days or still missing. So what I thought was interesting is that 72% of Indigenous people are found within a week, which is a high number. I feel like that's a good number. As you can see, 30% return in less than a day, and another 41% are returned or located within a week. The good news is that 97.8% of Indigenous person cases are resolved. So just like Brian said, law enforcement has located them, they've been cleared, or the entry was canceled. So we are calling those resolved cases. We still had 51 Indigenous people missing at the end of 2019, but we knew by the 1st of April that 28 of those cases had been resolved in 2020. So the ones that were still missing at the end of 2019 might have only been missing a few days. Some of them had been missing long-term, and some, are still missing now. But at least 28 of them were resolved last year.
I'm sorry, Tina, is the 97.8 supposed to add up to 100 with the 3.2 in the graph?
Yes.
Because that equals 101. One of those two numbers is in error.
Okay. Yes, you're right. I see that. I'll have to take a look at that. Thank you.
Yeah, just an oopsie. Apologies. I'm
problem.
going to switch gears, and I'm going to talk about active missing person cases. This would be a snapshot that was taken 2 days ago. Because missing person cases are pretty dynamic, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll move by it kind of fast. Missing person cases are dynamic. I have to take a snapshot of what's going on at that exact moment when preparing a presentation, either for the task force or as we're speaking to you guys. So as of 2 days ago, we had 173 active missing person cases. That's total of all races. 54 of those 173 were identified as Indigenous persons, meaning 31%. Of those 54, 28 were under the age of 21. We are seeing a difference in male versus female missing. We see 32 females versus 22 males. 19 missing persons were flagged as a runaway in the database. What that means is that law enforcement, they have a flag. It doesn't mean that response is different, but it does indicate that that youth likely had left or went missing on their own versus an abduction, non-custodial parent abduction, things like that. And then 20 Indigenous persons have been missing for over a year with the active data. Because we just talked a whole bunch about statistics, and Tina talked a bunch about 3-year statistics. We also want to remind folks that it's not just statistics that we deal in. I mean, these are people that have families, that have loved ones that they just don't have answers. So this slide and the next slide is to basically represent, these are the missing Indigenous persons we have here in Montana. Law enforcement has an active case for, and they are investigating these cases. I've shaded it a little different. So what you'll see is the top 5, we've got people missing 5 years or more. Then in the lighter red, we've got people that are missing 1 year to 5 years. And then towards the bottom, we've got folks that are missing 6 months to 1 year. And then these are a little bit more recent missing persons cases. We've got folks that are missing basically more than a month to 6 months. And then the bottom blue shaded section will be people missing 0 days to 30 days to a month. When we look at a breakdown of how these are reported, Tina had the map a little bit earlier for the 3-year data study. It's not really just a, hey, this happens on the reservations, or hey, this happens in large urban Indian centers. Pretty much it happens everywhere. We've got missing Indigenous persons entered by 18 different law enforcement agencies across Montana. That it's pretty widespread. It's definitely something we see, and this just shows you the frequency of missing persons, how many they have active cases, and which law enforcement agencies entered them.
So I did a little work on 2020 preliminary data. We actually have our data being confirmed by MSU. There's a statistical consulting and research group at MSU that has reviewed our 2017 to 2019 data and confirmed the numbers. And then they are working on their final report for the 2020 data. But I thought it would be good to show you what we're looking at for last year. Last year could have been very much an anomaly because of COVID. We're not really sure if it changed things or not. The good thing about this data is that we have a starting point. So we've started with 2017 to 19. We now have 2020, and we'll be able to start identifying trends and what we're seeing by race, by age, and different data points. But for 2020 data, we had 2,023 entries, so very similar to the number that we had in 2019. 615 of those entries were Indigenous, which makes up 30%. So we're right on target for a third of our missing people being Indigenous. 1,437 of those 2,000 entries are unique individuals, and of those individuals, 418 or 29% are Indigenous. We looked at multiple entries. So again, the people that are entered missing more than one time, 880 for all races, 291 for Indigenous people, and that's 33%. If you break it down into unique individuals from those multiple entries, you can see again that Indigenous people make up 32% of the overall multiple entries. For cases that have been resolved, we've got good numbers. 1,927 cases were resolved for all races. And if you look at just Indigenous, 576 have been resolved. That means that 14% of the overall resolved cases are Indigenous. So we're not resolving those cases as quickly or as easily as the other cases. That leaves 96 unresolved cases overall. 39 of those were Indigenous, and that was 41%.
Tina?
Yes.
When I divide 1927 into 576, I get something more like 25%, 28%. I think that number might be wrong in the 14.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
Brian, can you move to the next one?
You bet, I already did.
So where does that take us? That takes us to 2021 legislation. We've got 4 MMIP bills as strategies to address what we've learned. Senate Bill 4 has passed and has been enrolled. That means that it's up for signature. This extends the Missing Persons Task Force for 2 more years and adds additional duties that they need to identify causes that contribute to missing and murdered Indigenous persons and make recommendations to tribes to reduce the number of missing person cases. The second bill is House Bill 35, House Bill 98, which is to extend the Missing Persons Task Force and the LINK program. So the task force will be extended similarly to Senate Bill 4. They were kind of side-by-side bills, only House Bill 98 included a little additional language. They've both passed. They will take both of those bills, and when they create state law, it will likely have very similar information coming from the 2 bills. So the grant program is also extended another 2 years. We have House Bill 35, which is to establish a Missing Persons Review Commission, and they will examine cases where missing persons were not resolved and examine the trends and patterns, come up with some policies and practices that can reduce the incidence and include jurisdictional collaboration. And finally, we've got House Bill 36, which has passed the House and Senate, but right now it is stuck in Senate Finance and Claims Committee. This is to establish the Missing Persons Response Team Training Grant. It would be another grant program similar to LINK, only this one would provide travel funds for teams, community-based teams that work in response for missing persons. It would provide travel expenses for them to attend response team training. So we took a lot of your time. We didn't realize that, and I apologize, but this is the time for questions, or if there's additional data points that you think would be interesting, all for us to have no more missing sisters, no more stolen sisters, no more missing persons across the state of Montana.
What actions are you recommending we take to try to get that finance bill unstuck and passed?
It's had its hearing. I think it is just waiting for executive action now.
Oh, so it's not really stuck, actually. It's going to end up being passed like all the others, you think?
I hope so, but I can't say that for sure.
And we can't really do anything to affect the outcome, is what you're saying?
Right.
Okay.
At this time. So Brian created a resource list for you. These are the web addresses that you can find the MMIP task force, the reporting for a missing person through the LINK system, the Montana Missing Persons Clearinghouse, and the state legislature.
Otherwise, this is our information in case anybody has anything else or they want to talk to us offline, but we really appreciate everybody's time. We know we took up an awful lot of it. I apologize. I want to leave a little bit more time, but I ramble, so there's that.
No, I thought it was great. Thank you guys both. That was really excellent.
You bet. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We sure appreciate it. Thanks to everyone for being here, and especially to Tina and Brian for all that information.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you, everybody. Jamie, do you want me to hang out a little bit or let us hang out a little bit in case people have additional questions? But otherwise, that's what I have.
That sounds perfect. We'll wait just a minute more.
I just want to thank you guys for what you're doing for the state of Montana. I know that it can be kind of an energy sucker and emotional, emotionally draining. So we really do appreciate what you're doing for the state of Montana.
Thank you, Cindy. We appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Shannon, thanks so much for inviting us to participate today. You had a really good group.
Oh, thank you. I mean, you guys always do such a phenomenal job. I could listen to you for hours.
It's a lot though.
Yeah, there's a lot of information. I know that it's kind of overload, but we appreciate it. And sorry we took so long. We didn't mean to cut right up to the time.
No, you guys are doing an amazing job. I really appreciate it. Our task force really relies on your guys' information to move forward with our goals and missions. So we appreciate that.
You bet. If you guys have questions or need something from us, by all means, reach out. That's what we're here for.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You bet. I'm going to log out unless somebody has anything else. I think we're good.
All right. Thank you. Have a
Thanks.
great day, you guys.
You too.
Thanks, Jamie.
Everyone. Shanna, you can just end the meeting for everyone.